So I wanted to take this knife and turn it into a garden knife. The sheath is pretty good. It's Kydex, but it's a little bulky to just stick in your pocket. And it's a Tonto tip, which I don't really use for carving a lot. So I thought I would carve a new sheath for it out of wood and wrap it in rawhide. That is pine and osage for the thumb push. It fits in there fairly snugly, but then with a little pressure from the thumb, it pushes right out. That'll be even more snug once the rawhide is wrapped partially around the handle. I cut out a piece of rawhide I had laying around that would wrap around the wooden insert part of the knife sheath and then have a top part that would maybe be a belt loop or something like that. This picture here shows it tacked up with some finish nails after I had cut it out and soaked it for a while. Then took it down when it was dry and did some quick sanding on it and turned out pretty flat. And you can see how thin it is here. I re-soaked it, put it around the knife sheath wooden insert, and kind of marked out where I thought the sewing would go, cut it to shape, punched the hole, sewed it up. And then here you can see the part that would attach to your belt. I've got clamped flat with some wood to just hold its shape and make it easier to lay out. After it dried, I decided I didn't like the idea of attaching it to a belt and that instead I wanted to try attaching some sort of a clip to the back of this sheath. Not sure how I was going to do it yet, but it worked out pretty well. I didn't really like the way the rawhide looked at the stitching. I thought I wanted to do something different there. I had put that piece of deer bone at the end of the knife sheath to maybe use as a lanyard. Ended up not keeping that either. And in fact, ended up re-soaking the sheath altogether and redoing it to something a little bit more pleasing, as you'll see. But before I went to re-soaking and modifying it, I wanted to hear what the different sheaths sounded like now. This is just a strip of rawhide I picked up to see what that sounded like. To remove the rawhide, I needed to soak it, so I folded up a square of a paper towel and saturated it with water and just left it on top of the knife sheath. And then the next day came back and it had saturated the rawhide completely and was able to pry it off. Here you see I had set it aside for another day or so and it just dried out. Here's the belt clip I found that I thought would work pretty well, and the grommets or eyelets that are sized to match those holes. And then this is where I think it's going to be. Drew some circles just to reference it. Then I carved some divots, pretty shallow divots there to help hold the base of the grommets in place, thinking that they wouldn't move when the rawhide was drying around that wooden insert. So at this point, then I re-soaked the rawhide, wrapped it around the sheath, marked out where the grommets were going to be, cut really tiny little holes, put the grommets in, and then wrapped it back around the wooden insert and whip stitched it up from the bottom towards the top and then went back down whip stitching using the same holes, tied that off, then wrapped the whole thing with some jute twine to see if it would make a neat pattern. Got some wood, sandwiched it between the wood, put it in a vise to hopefully impress that pattern into the rawhide as it dried, and then left it there for a while. Actually ended up using hemp cordage instead of jute. Here you can see that the edges where I had sewed it together were all kind of arranged underneath that hemp cordage, the same way to make it look kind of neat. Here's how it turned out near the thumb push area. And then from the underside in the clamps, another view from the side, and here it is at the bottom. So the rawhide dried pretty nice and snug around the wooden insert and around the handle section of the knife itself. I had put some shims by the handle in the rawhide area just to make sure that there would be enough clearance for the knife handle to slide out of the sheath, but some resistance so that it wouldn't fall out like you can see here. You'll also notice that I had filled in the inside of the little grommets with some JB weld just to further anchor them in place. And then just with a little pressure from the thumb, it comes out pretty easy. Now that the fit was pretty good and established, I coated the whole thing with amber shellac. Amber shellac has not been de-waxed, so it makes a really good coating for stuff like rawhide. And its abrasion resistance isn't that of polyurethane, but it's pretty much non-toxic. And it actually has more resistance to vapor permeability than polyurethanes and stuff like that. And I may want to sand that shellac coating off at some point if I want to re-soak this sheath and modify it again in the future. So the shellac dried really nice. It didn't loosen anything up, and the stitching turned out a lot better than the first time I tried it out. So I like that. I like the little marks left by the cordage I wrapped around it. The knife still comes out and slides in pretty securely. So pretty good project. So at this point, it's been about a month and a half, maybe 2 months, and I wanted to just do some final thoughts on this knife sheath. It worked. I like it. I've used it a lot, and it's still really secure. And in fact, it's gotten just a tad bit tighter, which is fine. I'll show you where it rubs against the knife handle later on. This project had three main goals. One was utilitarian. I just needed a different style knife sheath for this knife and how I intended to use it. The second was to just experiment with some modern methods, modern tools, primitive tech, primitive tools, and just see what happened. Because a lot of times I do projects partially because I do need a finished project, but also just to see what happens along the way. So this was definitely a cool project. I learned a lot more about grommets and how I would manipulate rawhide in the future. Also, you'll hear a little bit later how the shellac really affected the sound of the rawhide. Definitely made it a little bit louder. I like the color. It's too bad some of that variegated pattern that you saw initially in the rawhide kind of faded away, disappeared a little bit after it was sanded and the shellac applied. So I wish I would have kept a little bit more somehow of that pattern there. And the third aspect of this project was just kind of more artistic, just to see could I make something that looked really neat, to my eye and pleasing. But that also has some function, form and function. It was pretty cool. You can see here that the spring steel belt clip is still securely attached. Still comes out with a push of the thumb, so pretty tight in there. Snaps in pretty nice and secure. You can see there, that area right there, it's a little discolored. That's where the fibers are getting stretched out by that part of the knife handle. You can even see it push it up a little bit as I draw the knife out and put it back in. See it move there a little bit. Perfect. Happy with that. Grommets still look pretty good where I'd filled them in with the JB Weld. So the sound of the knife sheath definitely changed after the application of the shellac. Not too bad there. In that open area, certainly vibrates a little bit more. It's like a little echo chamber. But once it's in there, no rattle, no sound, no nothing. Not that it matters to me for this knife, just something interesting to know. And yeah, I think that's it.